Everybody, welcome back to World History. So today we're doing two sections. So we're doing sections 2 and 3 of chapter 14. So go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. Let me move my little bubble up here. So Portugal begins to gain a foothold. So what we're going to be mostly focusing on today is the aftermaths of Columbus discovering the New World, aka the Americas. So we're going to be talking a lot about how Portugal expands their colonial holdings to the New World and how other countries reacted to this as well. Now, Portugal began setting up small forts along the coast of Africa initially, so we're going to start back in Africa and then jump over here. So, they did this to collect food and water and repair ships and trade directly with their sources in Africa rather than using a middleman, because it's easier just to do it the direct way instead of having to go through another person. They also established trading posts to trade muskets, tools, and cloth for gold, ivory, hides, and slaves, mainly trading those good European goods that they could make for the things that they couldn't produce in Portugal, but were in abundance in Africa. Now, the Portuguese would attack African trading cities like Mombasa and Malindi, which were hubs of international trade, with the goal of getting rid of the Arabs that were in the region to further their own advancement in the region. That was their initial goal. Get rid of them, everybody else, then you have a monopoly. Excuse me. So, the African slave trade. Let me push that up a little bit further. So, from the 15 to 1600s, slaves were viewed as the most important good that was being traded. The Portuguese would join this profitable slave trade, followed by many European countries, including the British, the Spanish, the French, the Italians, and they would exchange European goods for slaves. Mainly anything that they could produce in their country or in Europe were eligible to be traded for human beings. Now, Europeans would use slaves to perform labor on their large estates or the plantations, and some would be used as household servants, so like as maids and butlers. During the 1500s, Europeans were encouraging a much broader slave trade than they would further down the line, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So, triangular trade. You probably have heard about this briefly, but it is referring to the trade between the New World, Europe, and Africa, and it illustrates how different goods are being taken to different places. So, all these red arrows are coming from Europe. So these are all manufactured goods that can't be made in the Americas or in Africa. The green represents those that are coming out of Africa, so things like slaves, gold, ivory, things that can't be really found anywhere else. And then the yellow represents the New World, so the Americas specifically, and that's things like rum, tobacco, cotton, certain crops that can't be grown physically in Europe that are native here to the Americas. So, slaves could be traded for textiles, metalwork, rum, tobacco, weapons, and gunpowder. Really, the value of a human being could be simply a gun. And over the next 300 years, the slave trade exploded into the largest profitable business in the world at the time. Every year, thousands of people would be shipped across the Atlantic to work on sugar, rice, and tobacco plantations here in the United States and in the Caribbean and in Central America. So some African leaders wanted to stop the slave trading, but the supporters were just too strong. Think about it. If you're just a local king in Africa going up against major European powers, do you stand much of a chance? More than likely, no. One of those people being Alfonso I, the ruler of Congo. Now, he was tutored by Portuguese missionaries, and these are people who wanted to convert others to a religion, primarily Christianity or Catholicism, and was against the slave trade. He appealed to the Europeans, specifically the Portuguese, to stop the slave trade. They said, yeah, no, they weren't going to stop. He did want to convert Africans to Christianity, but he saw the slave trade as an affront to Christianity. And as more and more slaves were traded, some kingdoms became very small. However, other kingdoms emerged who depended on the slave trade. These states would wage war on the smaller African states so they could have more slaves to turn over and make money from those European countries. One of them being the Asante Kingdom. which owned land in present-day Ghana. This was ruled by Ose Tutu, a powerful king and military leader that was based there. So, a little bit more of the Asante Kingdom. Tutu claimed his right to rule came from heaven, so a divine right, and he was trying to unify his kingdom in order to fight off other states. Now, the Asante eventually ran a monopoly on gold mining and slave trade in Africa, becoming the most powerful body that wasn't a European power. As a reminder, a monopoly is an exclusive control of a business or industry, meaning you owned every single aspect of it in a given area. This allowed them to build a wealthy and powerful kingdom that would not be rivaled for a long time. We also have the Oyo Empire, settled by the Yoruba people of present-day Nigeria, and it began as a relatively small forest kingdom, but the leaders would then use the wealth that they earned from the slave trade to build an army. They conquered the neighboring kingdom of Dahomey, and they continued to gain more wealth by trading with European merchants at Porto Novo. Realistically, a lot of these empires that we're talking about benefited from selling out their fellow human beings and trading them for goods. So, after a while, European presence is going to begin to expand in Africa, and a lot of countries are going to follow Portugal's lead of establishing trading ports. The British, the Dutch, and the French would all do this when Portuguese power began to decline. And by 1652, Dutch farmers known as the Boers settled Cape Town in South Africa, which is the first permanent European settlement in Africa. And over time, they ousted and enslaved South Africans, and there was a lot of violence with other African groups. We'll talk a lot more about South Africa next semester when we talk about apartheid and all that stuff, but just kind of keep that in mind as we're going forward. So in the European presence, by the mid-1600s, the British and French both had reached present-day Senegal, and the French established a fort around the 1700s. By 1788, Britain established the African Association that sponsored explorers going to Africa. Now, this led to an explosion of European exploration of Africa. Really, our earliest safaris really began in this period too. Yeah. We're going to skip that and jumping straight into section 3. So we're going to jump over to Asia for a bit. So once again, Portugal taking a foothold. They were the first European power to gain a foothold in Asia. After Vasco da Gama's voyage, the Portuguese moved into the Indian Ocean. During this time, the Mughal dynasty was controlled much of India, and established by Muslim rulers, they were originally from Central Asia. Eventually, in southern India, Portugal was able to seize lands from local princes and gain a foothold. With this power, the Portuguese wanted to take over the entire Indian Ocean for themselves. So, by 1510, they turned the island of Goa into a military and commercial base, under the direction of Commander Alfonso de Albuquerque, who led these attacks. They would then take over the Moluccas in 1511 from the Muslims. Again, we talked about the Moluccas already. And use these ports to trade and repair their ships. Now, it had a limited impact overall. They lacked resources and faced a lot of resistance the further inland they went. And they made harsh efforts to convert Muslims. Fewer than 1 million people would actually be converted. Now, just as the Portuguese were rising, the Dutch also experienced a major resurgence of their power as well. By 1599, the Dutch fleet returns home after a year. Excuse me. They brought pepper, cloves, and other spices with them. This led to more exploration activity because of their strong foothold in Cape Town. Now, a few years later, 1602, the Dutch East India Company will be formed. Now, this will have tremendous power, and explorations would be tightly controlled by the government. But the Dutch East India Company had full sovereign powers, meaning they could build armies, wage war, and govern overseas without the oversight of the Dutch government. They could then dominate trade in the region by taking over multiple territories. So, 1641, the Dutch actually take Malacca from the Portuguese, and then they open trade with China. This allowed them to open a monopoly in the Spice Islands. Now, the Dutch were not afraid to use military force to achieve its goals. By the 1700s, the Dutch power would begin to decline due to the growing power of England and France. really, when we talk about European history, a lot of the big stuff that we can focus on is based upon which country's in power at the time. If you notice at the beginning of the chapter, we primarily focused on the Portuguese. Now we're focusing on the Dutch. Later on this semester, it's going to shift to the Spanish, the English, and the French. See, we're already up to the Spanish. So they'll seize the Philippines or the archipelago by proxy by Magellan in 1521. Within 50 years, Spain had captured and colonized the islands. Now, the Philippines were not a united country. They were each individual governments on each island and were easily conquered by the Spanish. Now, Spanish priests would be sent to try and convert them to Christianity, and the Philippines would become a key link in Spain's overseas trading empire. Spain now could trade between the lands of Mexico and China a lot easier. Silver from Mexico could be used to buy goods in China. The Philippines made for a good midway point between the two. Now, a little bit on India and European trade. They had a lot of valuable stuff. Mughal India was a center for spice trading. India is home to a lot of our major spice production today. It was larger and richer than any country in Europe, and the leading exporter of textiles, specifically silk and cotton. Now, the Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French would eventually gain trading rights here and were permitted to build forts and warehouses in Indian coastal towns. But that's still a little bit of ways away. Excuse me. Now, civil wars in the region would then drain the resources there, and the Dutch, British, and French would all establish Indian trading companies. Each company organized its own army of sepoys or Indian troops, and by the mid-1700s, the Dutch were pretty much out of play at this point. It was the British and French that had become locked in a bitter struggle for global power. To the point that the British will use the East India Company and sepoys to drive out the French from India entirely to claim it for themselves. So, that is it for notes for today. There is no new assignment, so you don't have anything to worry about. Let me pull that back down here so you can see me. There we go. Again, you don't have a new assignment. I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.